Welcome back to American Literature. I want to demonstrate the process for you now, choosing a work of literature that was not included in this course. And it's a poem by William Stafford, who died shortly after the year 2000. He wrote this poem in 1998, even before, I think, 9/11. And so what I want to do first is just read the poem at the Unnational Monument along the Canadian border. This is the field where the battle did not happen, where the unknown soldier did not die. This is the field where the grass joined hands, where no monument stands, and the only heroic thing is the sky. Birds fly here without any sound, unfolding their wings across the open. No people killed or were killed here on this ground, hollowed by neglect and an air so tame that people celebrate it by forgetting its name. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to do is make sure you really read the poem a couple of times or read the story a couple of times and really come to terms with what it's about. Take notes. So what I did was I highlighted things that struck me as important. An unnational monument. The Canadian border gave me kind of a location, and location comes up again in the first two lines. The battle did not happen here, and this is not the grave or the monument of the unknown soldier. No one died here. Location. The things that I have highlighted in turquoise struck me as being not either natural, like the grass that joins hands, in contrast to, the monument, and heroic and sky. These things seem to me to be almost opposite, so I'm just trying to pay attention to them, remember to come back. Alright, so I did a little bit of research on William Stafford, and I discovered some things that he was a pacifist during World War II, so that's a long time ago, and he described himself as being from the quiet of the land. So that is from the Poetry Foundation, and I cite that later on. So I want you just to see, and I'm going to highlight it for you for a second, that when you're citing from an online short source, you want to give the paragraph number. In poems, you want to give the line number. If you're working with a text, that's page number. So other things that are relevant. Notice what's not relevant. I'm not mentioning where he went to high school or college, whether he was married 12 times. I don't know anything about him that way. What I do know are the things that are relevant to the poem. It's kind of a peace-loving poem, and he was a conscientious objector. And I went and I looked at Gale. I just looked up William Stafford and Poetry for Students and found a good background quote and piece of information. Though anti-war protesters are somewhat common in America today, objectors in the 1940s war against Germany and Japan were scarce, and they were viewed as cowardly and un-American. In reality, however, it required a great deal of moral strength to voice objection to America's participation in the war. This moral strength would become a noble quality of Stafford's work 2 decades later. Like, he comes back to this a couple of times. He really believed in peace, and he was not, the sort of standard hippie. He had come of age in the middle of the 20th century, not in the 1960s or 70s. All right, so you want to connect the poem with a work of literature. Maybe you are working with a short story to something that's relevant today in American culture, something that will give it meaning. So I started thinking about this. Well, there are monuments and unmonuments now. We are struggling with monuments in this. Is there anything going on with monuments? Well, yes, we practically have a social civil war going on over Civil War monuments. So what could we maybe learn from this poem? And I went and I found another article written by a man named Bennett, and I cited him, who writes about war monuments, and he did, ironically, in the year that this poem was published. So he wrote something that really caught my attention. Traditionally, we glorify war and warriors instead of peace and peacemakers. And he is speaking about monuments in general. And I think he goes on to say that many writers, including Stafford, have questioned war monuments in the past. So Stafford's not necessarily unusual in celebrating the longest peaceful border in the world, the one between Canada and the United States. Bennett, the expert in monuments, says writers have contributed to the growth of this subordinate perception as well. Instead of assuming that the veneration for these sacred monuments is essential to national survival, writers examine the origins, consequences, and meaning or meaninglessness of war by competing for the interpretation of powerful events and myths. All right, I thought that really made me think. This was an important article for me. Make sure you keep track of your sources through Noodlebib. I'm going to go up to Noodlebib to show you some of the things that I did. I'm going to drag this over here so you can see that I have loaded all of my sources in using the Add button. And I can tell when students have used this source or not, because all you have to do to get a beautiful list of works cited is to generate it, and it will come up on your screen, and it will be absolutely perfect, just as this one is. And then you will see that your in-text citations appear here in the margins. Now, it's always, by the way, last name first, first names last. So it's not that it will be a document you do not have to proofread. You will have to proofread it. But nonetheless, if you're quoting from Bennett in your in-text citation in parentheses or in your signal phrase, you say Bennett. If you're quoting your poet or your writer, you say Stafford, where you cite that. If you're quoting a biography that has Stafford William as the title, it's Stafford William. And down here, when these sources are like encyclopedias, they have absolutely no writers. So encyclopedias have no writers. So it does seem to be like that. So this is my list of works cited. I wanted to show you how easy it was to generate. Okay, so I'm going to go back to your signature assignment. I'm going to drag it over here, and I'm going to show you where I began. You can go ahead and read it for yourself too, but I want you to make sure that you go through a good writing process. Brainstorm your thesis statement, right? Write yourself into it. Write about the work of literature for a little while before you decide what point you're going to make. This did not come out of the blue, so this is what I'm working with right now. As American citizens battle over Confederate Civil War monuments, they might consider why we glorify war instead of peace with statues erected in public spaces. Poet William E. Stafford rejects war memorials altogether in the poem At the National Monument Along the Canadian Border, which was published in 1998. The poem suggests, come back to the work of literature, and the poem suggests that even the grave of the unknown soldier deserves scrutiny, as memorializing war and warriors perhaps perpetuates violence. Now I'm going to go on and I'm going to cite that passage that Bennett has contributed to my thinking. And then I want you to go through and keep a bulleted list for yourself of all of the observations that you've made. The monument in this poem is unnational. which doesn't mean that it is unpatriotic. It means that it recognizes that successful collaborative efforts are often between countries. They're not belonging to one nation. The poem itself celebrates a hallowed ground. That's a word from the poem where the unknown soldier did not die. And I want you to see in the poem, you cite the line number. I don't have to keep mentioning Stafford because I've already established that he wrote the poem. So I'm only ever going to mention the line number. All right, so in contrast to war monuments, even monuments to unknown soldiers, war monuments are unnatural compared to places where not only two nations, but the very grass joined hands. That's in line 3. You'll remember I highlighted that earlier. Instead of cannon fire, gun salutes, or civil protests over the unmonument, it is a place of exquisite silence as birds fly over it without any sound. This goes back to something that Stafford said about himself, so I'm beginning to make connections. The most important observation the speaker makes is that no people killed. There are no murderers or soldiers or warriors here, and no one was killed, suggesting that non-violence deserves acknowledgement and praise. Maybe non-violence deserves the monument. Right? So the irony, when things are not as they appear, is that people are so conditioned, as Bennett observes, to glorify war that no one pays homage to peace. The peace is hallowed, but no one even knows the name of this sacred location in the poem. So I'm well on my way. I have to draw a conclusion at the end, like, what could we get out of this? What can I get out of this? Perhaps our country and other countries around the world could pause to consider why we honor war and warriors with statues. Why are we committed as a country to the makers of violence rather than the makers of peace? Perhaps resisting violence is as patriotic or more patriotic than firing weapons to kill perceived enemies instead of doing the hard work of peace. It's just, that's the conclusion that I am drawing and that I would lead up to. So, writing is a process, and in order to get a good paper, you really do need to go through a note-taking process, conducting research, learning things that you hadn't considered, and making sense of a work of literature in the context of the culture and world that we share and live in right now. So you can leave that even to the end. It makes a great conclusion, by the way, to plug a work of literature into perhaps a current event, but always foreshadow it. Okay, I hope that helps you get started and is a nice review for you of how to go about writing the signature assignment essay. Let me know if you have any questions.